We are studying Pirkei Avos, Perek chapter 4, and we're now at Mishnah Vav, Mishnah number 6. Now, what's interesting about this Mishnah is that it's attributed to a rabbi called Rabbi Yossi. And the reason I say that is interesting is because if you have a look in different places, you'll come across various Rabbi Yossis. So the question is, which one are we talking about here? So, for example, there is Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Yossi of the Galilee. There is Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. And in this particular case, we're going to be learning a teaching of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta. That's his name, Rabbi Yossi ben Bar Chalafta. Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta. So why is that interesting? Why is it relevant to us to know who we're talking about? So here's a fascinating thing. There are certain names, as you can well imagine, that are names that appear multiple times during the course of a period in history. Certain names were common. So usually you use an identifier. In other words, if there are a whole lot of Rabbi Yehudas around, you want to know which Rabbi Yehuda you're talking about, right? So you'll say it's Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Then I'll know which Rabbi Yehuda you're talking about. I'll say it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. When you just have the name without an attribution, it means one of two things. Either it means that was the only person with that name, Rabbi Akiva. So you don't have to tell me which Rabbi Akiva, because I know there's only one Rabbi Akiva. Or, as in this case, it means that Rabbi Yossi, without any identifier, just plain Rabbi Yossi, means that out of all the Rabbi Yossis that we could refer to, this is the one that is most commonly known. So we have to wonder, why is Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta the well-known Rabbi Yossi? What about him made him the well-known Rabbi Yossi? And the answer to that is very relevant to our conversation and to the Mishnah that we're going to study today. To understand why Rabbi Yossi is, so to speak, so well-known or so popular, talks to the message that he's going to share with us in this particular Mishnah. So why is Rabbi Yossi, so to speak, well-known? Why is Rabbi Yossi so to speak, popular? So the reason for that is because the Gemara tells us a very interesting thing about Rabbi Yossi. It says that if there was a debate between Rabbi Yossi and other members of the community, other members of the rabbinic community, so what would happen is that you would always follow Rabbi Yossi's view. Now, very often in the course of the Talmudic discourse, there are disagreements between different rabbis. And usually the principle is that you put it out to almost a vote, and acharei rabim lahatois, as the verse tells us, you always follow majority opinion. However, there are certain individuals who are considered to be such exceptional scholars that if there's a debate between them and somebody else, we'll always follow their view because they are considered to be such a brilliant scholar. And that's exactly how it is with Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, that if there's a debate, or as is generically known Rabbi Yossi, if there's a debate between him and his contemporaries, we follow his opinion. Why? Says the Gemara, because Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, whenever he'd give an opinion, it would always be nimukoi imoi, which means to say that he would always give a rational explanation why that is the correct opinion. Now, of course, that's very compelling, right? When a person says, this is the halacha, I believe that this is the halacha, and they could be correct, it's not nearly as powerful as a person who says, let me explain it to you in a way that you could relate to, in a way that you could appreciate why this is the halacha. In other words, not just to pull rank and say, well, I'm the expert, and I've done my research, and I know what the answer is. Nimukoi imoi, he would always give an explanation that was relevant and that could be understood by the individuals. In fact, when there was a debate, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, so just put into context, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is right at the tail end of the Mishnah period. He was the person who collated all of these teachings together and formed the Mishnah as we know it. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would say about Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta that you have to understand our opinions compared to his opinion are as far apart as the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the Jewish community of the Beis HaMikdash, the holiest place on earth, compared to Choil, something which is not even part of the city of Jerusalem. So, in other words, his teachings were at such a level, at such a brilliant level of teaching, so he was considered completely in a league of his own. I meant to say this at the beginning of the shir, but now that I mentioned Yerushalayim, just reminded me, we'll dedicate today's learning for the Aliyas Neshama of Eliyahu David ben Avram Chaim. So this was the greatness of Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta, that he was in this incredible level of absolute wisdom that he could translate into a way that you and I could understand. And not only you and I, but if you're familiar with Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta's story, so one of the things that you'll know about his story is, well, firstly, he landed up having to leave the center of Jewish learning at the time, and he landed up going to a place called Tzipori, which subsequently became a center of learning. And the reason for that is because he spoke out against the Roman authorities, and they didn't take very well to that. We know that from the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If you speak out against the Romans, eventually you got to run for your life. So Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta landed up in this place called Tzipori, and they say that when he was in Tzipori, which was a little bit isolated from the rest of the Jewish community, he had regular visitations from Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. So that already tells you what kind of a person he is. On the one end of the scale, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi tells us that he's like the Holy of Holies. We know that he had these interactions with Eliyahu Hanavi on a regular basis, on the one hand. And yet on the other hand, not only did he interact with ordinary people in the Jewish community, but his sphere of influence extended beyond the Jewish community as well. And that's going to be a big part of the conversation we're going to learn in terms of what he teaches in this Mishnah. You see, because the Gemara tells us that there was this particular matrunisa, which effectively means a Roman noble woman. There were certain rabbis during the course of their experience living in Israel under Roman rule who had interactions with the nobility. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi got all the way to the top, to the emperor himself. He had a very close relationship with the Emperor Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius. We know that Rabbi Akiva had interactions with various noble Romans. Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta had this particular Roman noble woman who used to consult with him. And she had all kinds of questions about philosophy and about Judaism. And whenever she came to encounter him and to interact with him, he'd always give explanations to her that were so clear and lucid and rational that she would always come out praising God, which was unusual, of course, for Romans, pagan Romans at the time. Probably the most famous story of the lot was when this Roman noblewoman came to Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta and she said, God created the world. I get that. I'm willing to accept that. But what has he been doing since then? Good question, right? What's he doing? He made this magnificent universe. And now, bearing in mind, of course, that she obviously had the impression that the world kind of runs on its own, which is not a Jewish value. We understand that Hashem is consistently involved in every detail of running the world. But that was her question. So Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta said to her, since the time of the creation of the world, Hashem has been putting together shidduchim, right? Matching up men and women. Now, anybody who is engaged with the experience of trying to find a shidduch for a child, for a friend, you'll know it's not so simple. So you clearly need Hashem's help. But this Roman noblewoman didn't see the wisdom in that. What's the big deal making shidduchim? Easy as pie. So Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta said, okay, if you think it's so simple, try it. So she went and she took 1,000 of her servants and matched them up with 1,000 maidservants, married them all off in one night in this massive ceremony. Might have been the first ever mass wedding on record. And she said, you see, you think it's such a big deal that God matches people up? I matched people up as well. However she did it, alphabetically or chronologically, however she did it, she just matched all the people up. Anyhow, the Gemara reports that over the next couple of days, there was a very big uptake in injuries in this crowd. This one came and this one was beaten and that one was unhappy, and it was a complete disaster. Out of all of these shidduchim that she made, almost none of them were sustainable. It was an absolute disaster. And at that point, she turns around to Rabbi Yosef and she says, okay, I get it. You are wise, the Torah is wise, and your God is wise. And she ate humble pie and she said, okay, I accept that to say that Hashem is constantly making shidduchim is actually a huge achievement. But the point that's relevant for our conversation is that Rabbi Yosef ben Chalafta had a sphere of influence that included outside of the Jewish community. Not only was he a teacher of Torah to Jewish people, but he was a teacher of Torah and of the principles of faith in God beyond as well. So let's see what Rabbi Yossi teaches in this Mishnah, Mishnah Vav, the 6th Mishnah of the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avos. So what does he say? He says, Rabbi Yossi says as follows, Kol hamechabed es haTorah, any person who gives honor to the Torah, gufoi mechubad al habrios, such a person will discover that he is honored by people. Okay, so if you give honor to the Torah, then you will be honored by people. There are a string of questions we have to ask about it. We'll come back to the questions in a second. Because then he gives a corollary and he says, any person who desecrates or dishonors the Torah, such a person will find that he is disgraced by people. So it's very clear that the attitude that we take towards the Torah will fundamentally impact the attitude that people will take to us. So as I say, there are a bunch of questions that we have to ask. The first question is context. Remember that the Mishnahs are placed in a particular order, and that order is very often that there's a content link between the previous Mishnah and this Mishnah. So we've got to work out what is the content link. One of the things that we learned in the previous Mishnah was that it's very important for a person to remember that you don't use the Torah for personal gain. So we said, Al ta'aseh Torah lehisgadel ba, that you shouldn't use the Torah as your crown for your own self-aggrandizement. Hey, look at me, I learned Torah, I'm a big deal. And you shouldn't use it even in the process of earning a living. Okay, so that's the touch point of the previous Mishnah, is that we have to be careful not to use Torah as a means of earning a living. Okay, we've got to reflect on that for a second. So what should you do then to earn a living? What kind of things should you do? Comes along Rabbi Yossi and he picks up from that and he says, you have to honor the Torah. What's the connection? You've just told me that I should not use the Torah as a way to honor myself or even as a way to earn a living. Now you're telling me I have to honor the Torah. What's the difference? What's the difference between saying don't abuse the Torah for personal use and saying honor the Torah? And what's the connection to earning a living? So you'd think, people, and this is what's fascinating, a number of the commentaries on this Mishnah point out the nature of human psychology. Bear in mind that we're talking about a Mishnah that was written close to 2,000 years ago. Bear in mind that the commentators on the Mishnah lived hundreds of years ago. And yet, what they discuss and describe is absolutely contemporary. Because human psychology remains human psychology. It doesn't matter where you live, doesn't matter what period of history it is. That is human psychology. There's certain elements, certain factors of human psychology that remain consistent throughout the course of history. Here's one of them. And that is how people respect people based on external appearances. So you might think, we're a vain modern world where everybody's posting selfies and sharing their wonderful experiences that they're having when they tour the world or showing how beautiful their life is. And people, unfortunately, are superficial enough to believe that stuff. So you actually think that because somebody posts a beautiful picture, that means they have a beautiful life. In fact, recently, and I may have shared the story with you, but recently, there's somebody I know who, because of COVID, they landed up being in quarantine. And he was saying how his teenage child was complaining bitterly. Here we are, it was actually a year ago, and you'll see why. Here we are, we're stuck in quarantine. It's so unfair. It's so limiting. Look at my friend. My friend is out there having a great time, having a vacation. Look at the picture they posted, the palm trees, the blue sky. So the parent had to say, listen, I'll tell you the truth. Your friend who's posting all these pictures is also in quarantine. And maybe they just have a palm tree in their garden. So they were able to get the angle with a tree and with a blue sky and give the impression that life is beautiful. It's human psychology, and things don't change, as the cliche tells us. So the nature of people is that they look at things from a very superficial perspective. And you'd expect that if a person doesn't use the Torah as their means of income, so then what do they have to do? They have to find another form of income, right? So you'd think, okay, you're a Torah scholar, then at least what you've got to do is you've got to learn Torah and accompany it with the kind of occupation that is honorable. That's what you'd think, because that's what people look at. They don't want to see you as a schlepper. Think about this. Think about this in real terms. If you had a person who was a blue-collar worker, but they happened to be a Torah scholar, the majority of the community would still not have the kind of respect for that person because they look like a blue-collar worker. We respect people who walk in with a suit, who drive a nice car, who seem to have a decent income, who seem to have some kind of an acronym after their name. Those are the people that everybody respects. Comes along Rabbi Yossi, and he says that's not how it works. If a person dedicates their life to showing honor and respect to the Torah, which includes their refusal to use the Torah as a way to elevate their status, earn an income. And because of that, they actually have to take what's a more menial job. And you would expect that because they're taking a menial job, people won't respect them. Let me tell you, says Rabbi Yossi, that's not the fact. As superficial as people are, they detect sincerity. That's the nature of people. We detect sincerity. And we appreciate and respect sincerity. So if you have somebody who is so sincere about the fact that I don't want to use the Torah for personal gain, and therefore I've undertaken this basic, perhaps even menial job, people will realize that, and they won't, as they normally do, write the person off and say, blue-collar worker. They'll look at the person with tremendous respect and say, somebody who values Torah more than they value themselves. Now, Rabbi Yossi put his money where his mouth is, because Rabbi Yossi, as his primary source of income, was a tanner of leather. Now, we don't relate to that, right? We live in the modern world. Well, what's a tanner of leather? What does that mean? Leather is stuff you buy in a retail shop. We don't understand what a tanner is. But bear in mind that in Halacha, it's brought in the Gemara, it's brought in Halacha, the Rambam talks about it. There's a principle around marriage which says, if a woman marries a man, and afterwards, after they get married, he now reveals to her that he's actually a tanner, it's grounds to say that the marriage was on false pretenses. Had I known, I would never have agreed to the marriage. Why? Because I don't know much about tanning leather, never done it. But it's one of those things that apparently you just cannot get rid of the stench. So the man comes home having worked as a tanner, and it's not a pleasant experience. It's enough of a reason for a woman to turn around and say, I was duped into this marriage. Had I known what I was getting into, I would never have accepted. And that's what Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta did. That was his job. Talk about a menial task. You're talking one of the greatest scholars that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says is like the holy of holies. And yet, out of his respect to Torah and his refusal to take anything of what the Torah has to offer as for personal gain, he was willing to be a tanner. Now, it's important to understand and remember that Pirkei Avos does not teach us the letter of the law. It teaches us that which is beyond the letter of the law. So strictly speaking, according to the letter of the law, it is acceptable that a person can be in the world of teaching Torah and they can receive remuneration for it, because at the end of the day, you have to live. But Rabbi Yossi wants to show us sensitivity. Yes, of course, I could justify earning a living and living off the community because of my Torah dedication, but I don't want to do that. It's perspective, it's sensitivity. I don't want to do that. I'd much rather give honor to the Torah, and then there's a sense that the people will come to honor me as a result. And not that I'm looking for that honor, but on the contrary, they will honor what I represent, which is the Torah. Big subject in its own right, by the way, is that very often a person will feel quite humble, and who am I, and why should I draw attention to myself? No, kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah. It's important that when a person represents Torah, it's important that they do so with dignity, and therefore insist that dignity is given to the Torah that they represent. This is not arrogance. The Gemara talks about it at length in the Gemara in Sota. Talks about how objectionable arrogance is. And nevertheless, the Gemara says, a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, has to have a shminis shebeshminis, which is like 1/64th of arrogance. In other words, enough dignity to be able to stand up and say, it is for the honor of the Torah that I insist upon certain things, certain level of respect. In fact, there's even an opinion over there in the Gemara that says the person who is arrogant should be excommunicated, and the Torah scholar who has no sense of self-esteem should also be excommunicated. It's not my kavod, it's the honor of the Torah. You know, the Gemara has an interesting observation. Sometimes you feel that there was a little bit of tension between the communities that lived in Israel and in Babylonia at the same time. In other words, post the destruction of the Second Temple. Sometimes you feel that there was just a little bit of tension sometimes between the two communities. And very often there was criticism of the Israeli community criticizing the Babylonian community. And here's one of them. They said, Hani bavloi tipshoi. Those foolish Babylonians. They're not referring to the non-Jews living in Babylonia. They're referring to the Jewish community in Babylonia. Foolish Babylonians, the Israeli community said. Because they rise when a Torah scroll enters the room, but they don't rise when a Torah scholar enters the room. And when you consider it, the Torah scholar has, in a sense, more Torah than the Torah scroll, because the Torah scholar obviously develops the Torah that they learn and adds value to the Torah. So kavod, when he talks about over here, kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah, anybody who gives honor to the Torah, one of the ways to give honor to the Torah is actually by showing honor to those people who study Torah. And it's a big part of our community and our thinking as a community that's how we behave. People who learn Torah are held in very high regard in our community, and appropriately so. Now, there's another way also that you could honor Torah. The Rambam speaks about this, and that is how we treat books that contain Torah knowledge. I think it's something which stymies the rest of the world. You know, if you think about it, if you had to go into the great libraries of Cambridge or Oxford, Harvard, wherever it is, if you had to go into the library and somebody was reading a book of philosophy, a book of science, whatever it might be, and while they were reading the book, they dropped the book on the floor, what would they do? Pick up the book, put it back where it belongs. When you finish reading the Odyssey, what do? Close the book. That's it. Jews have this strange custom. You close a book, what do? You kiss it. A book falls on the floor, what do? You kiss it. In fact, there's a Yiddish saying that says if money, or I think it's actually gold, I think the Yiddish saying says if gold and books fall on the floor, first pick up the books. No surprise then, I suppose, that they call us the people of the book. Although that's a misnomer, they should call us the people of the books in the plural. So for us in the Jewish world, a book is holy. For us in the Jewish world, a book that contains Torah has to be honored. The Rambam says that's what Rabbi Yossi is talking about over here when he says, Kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah, any person who honors the Torah, it actually means somebody who honors the books that contain the Torah. There's another explanation as well. I'll tell you a fascinating story that happened to me many years ago. It was at Wits University, and at that time I was involved with work on campus, and I was involved with Soldiers, the Union of Jewish Students, and it was the orientation week at the beginning of the year, where all the societies put out their wares and try and attract students to sign up to their societies. And a fellow came, just like I was the rabbi assisting soldiers. There was a fellow who was the mufti, the imam, or whatever the appropriate term is, who was assisting the Muslim Student Association. And he came over to me, and I thought it was really nice. He came over, and he was very friendly, and he engaged, and we spoke. And he went back to the table and said, I want to give you a gift. And he came and he gave me a Quran. So that's how I came to own a Quran. He came and he gave it to me. I said, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I thought it was a very nice gesture. And I took the book as any normal person would, and I just let my hand drop to my side, and I was carrying it away like that. He came running after me, and he said that the way you carry a holy book is you never carry it lower than your waist. It's disrespectful. And I thought that was a great lesson. Rabbi Yosef Yavot says that in this Mishnah, when it says Kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah, that a person honors Torah, it means the way that you carry a book of Torah should be with a tremendous amount of respect. You don't carry it like you carry the newspaper, lahavdil. You don't carry it like you carry Harry Potter, lahavdil. A Torah book has to be carried in a way that indicates absolute respect and that you cherish it, which is quite an incredible insight. So, Kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah, any person who honors Torah, gufoy mechubad al habrios, that person will be honored by the rest of the community, by the rest of the world. One of the ways that you honor the Torah is that you dig deep in your study of the Torah and you pay attention to the nuances of the Torah. Think about this logically. If you read something and you say, well, hang on a second, I'm not just going to read and rattle it off. I'm going to analyze and I'm going to pay attention to the wording. Why does it say the word this way? Why does it say the word that way? That shows that I have a tremendous respect for this information. I have tremendous respect for this book, because I'm not willing just to explore it superficially. So, Kol ha-mechabed es ha-Torah, how does a person show honor to the Torah? By delving into every part of the Torah with deep analysis, focusing on the nuances of language, and going through the stages of what we call pshat, remez, drush, soid, the 4 levels at which we're able to study and are required to study Torah. So pshat is to understand things at face value. Remez is to look carefully at the nature of the wording and what it represents and what it might allude to. Drush, which is the bulk of Torah learning, that's the comparison between different subjects and the way they're presented in different sources, and the full analysis of the language, the full analysis of the context, etc. And Soid, which is the Kabbalistic. So we're supposed to learn at all of those levels. If you respect Torah, then you want to know every degree of what the Torah has to offer and has to teach, which leads us straight back to our Mishnah, because there are 2 things about our Mishnah that seem a little bit unusual. What does he say? Any person who gives honor and respect to the Torah, his body. Now we're translating it literally. See, previously I just simply translated it as anybody who gives honor to the Torah will be honored. But if you pay close attention, because that's part of the honor of Torah, I pay close attention to the words. It says gufoy. The person's body will be honored by people. Now the question is, why does it say body? The fact that it says that you'll be honored, that's not such a surprise, because we know, and we say this regularly when we take out the Torah. What do we say? We say bismoila oisher v'chavod, that to the left side of Torah you get wealth and you get honor. So no surprise then, you give honor to the Torah. The Torah connects you to honor. In fact, that's how some of the Meforshim and the commentaries explain it. That there is only one real honor in the world, and that is the honor of Torah, like we're going to learn later in another Mishnah that's still to come, where ein kavod ela Torah, that the only real honor is Torah. All other honor is transient. It's only as long as people choose to honor you. As there's an expression from the second Rebbe of Chabad, that when he was arrested by the Tsarist government, he said, previously the Tsarist government had shown him tremendous respect. So there's a verse that we use it in the davening on Rosh Hashanah, Ein shikha lifnei chisei chavodecha, that in front of your holy throne, Hashem, there is no forgetfulness. So the second Rebbe said, in heaven there is no forgetfulness, and on earth there is no memory. That means to say that those who show you so much honor means nothing. Tomorrow it could completely dissipate and disappear. And sometimes for the weirdest of reasons. So what is real kavod is Torah. Torah is real honor. Why? Because Torah is a direct association with Hashem, and therefore it has meaning and true honor. So any person who shows honor to the Torah, that means that the person plugs themselves in to the source of real honor. It's only natural that people would honor them in response. So the person, in their physical form, their guf, their body is honored by others, because the body doesn't deserve honor. What's a body at the end of the day? It might have a certain appearance for a certain period of time, and perhaps during a certain period of time, people will be enamored with the appearance of the physical body, and then that's it, it's over. What happens, things start to sag, and they start to wrinkle, and the colors start to change, so the person doesn't look so amazing anymore. So what is real kavod? How can gufoy mechubad, how can a person's physical being be honored? When the person is plugged into real kavod, real honor, which is, as we'll learn later on, en kavod ela Torah. But that's still not a full explanation of why it says gufoy, the person's body. And in order to understand that, sometimes you have to play with punctuation. And that's actually how some of the commentaries explain that we should be looking at this particular explanation. Abarbanel says, or Abravanel, the more correct pronunciation. So Abravanel says, put the comma differently. Kol amechabed esatoira gufoy. Any person who uses their body to honor the Torah, mechubed al abriyos, that person will be honored by people. In other words, the idea is not simply to honor the Torah, but to be sure that you, says the Bible, that you are somebody who brings honor to the Torah. So we already spoke about the idea that sometimes a person may have to take menial labor in order not to rely on the Torah as their income. Now, the nature of menial labor is sometimes you don't look so good. You come home at the end of the day and you're covered in grease, and maybe your clothing gets torn, etc. Now the Shulchan Aruch says that a Talmid Chacham who has even a little bit of speck, a stain on his clothing, that could potentially desecrate Hashem's name. Can you imagine? Why? Says that Rabbi, no, because this principle, that the way that a person is supposed to show honor to the Torah is in their body, how you carry your body, how you walk around, as the Shulchan Aruch says, that you're not supposed to walk with your nose in the air, and at the same time you're not supposed to shuffle along as if you're some kind of a nebuch. You have to have some sense of dignity and some sense of presentability. So you be presentable to the community. That's who is mechubed al habrios, that person who shows that they honor the Torah. That's the kind of person who is going to bring honor to the Torah, because he represents the Torah and therefore honor to himself as well. Now the corollary is this: you would think, and this is again the nature of people, that who is respected in the world? People who present themselves as very respectable, people who have big deals, people who have many followers, people who have a lot of money, people who have political sway. That's typically who you expect is honored in the world. Comes along Rabbi Yossi and he says, just like you would expect that the person who does menial labor would be disrespected by the world, if they're doing so for the sake of the Torah, people will detect that sincerity and they will honor them. The corollary is also true. If a person shows disdain or disrespect to the Torah, it doesn't matter how much outside it they look good and they put on this show as if they're some kind of a big, suave something. At the end of the day, people will see right through it and they will not respect that individual. It is also interesting to note, some of the commentaries point out that this is something to really think about, because it's quite it hits home for many people. Let's say, we've already learned in the previous Mishnah that you're not supposed to use the Torah as your means of earning a living. That's clear. So you're supposed to have, as they call in today's world, a side hustle. Some way that actually generates income. And then you could sit and learn Torah without the distractions of this world. However, some people get this completely wrong, to the extreme, and this is hamechalel es haTorah. It's a way of behaving that actually desecrates the Torah. So the person says, I'm not going to use the Torah as a way to earn a living. So I'm not going to be the official rabbi, Rosh Yeshiva, teacher, whatever the case is, because I'm very alert to the fact that you're not supposed to use the Torah for yourself. At the same time, I don't want to waste my life doing a job on the side. Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, who repaired shoes. Or Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, who was a tanner. I don't want to be like that. I really want to be in the world of Torah, and that's where I want to live. But bottom line, you have to be able to get an income. So how do you earn an income? So this is the kind of person who now goes knocking on people's doors saying, please, you need to support me because I need to learn Torah. So some of the Meforshim point out that Kol HaMechalel es HaTorah, any person who desecrates the Torah. How do you desecrate the Torah? You desecrate the Torah by turning it into a scenario where you have to beg people for money. So what's the attitude that people are going to have? Oh, those leeches, those people who don't want to be productive, they don't want to work, they're lazy, relying on the community in order to support them. That kind of a person, the community rejects that kind of a person, desecrates, dishonors that kind of a person because they just don't see the value in that kind of a person. Now there's another word over here. We've focused on the fact that he says gufoi, that your body is mechubad, that your body is recognized and honored by people. There's another word over here that we also have to focus on, and that is the word brios. Brios is a very unusual word. We've had it before. We had it right in the beginning in the first chapter, where Hillel tells us that you have to be a student of Aaron HaKohen, who is Oihev Es HaBrios, is an individual who loves every single person, including those who are Brios, which is directly translated as creatures. So what exactly do we mean by that? We learned in the previous Mishnah that you're not supposed to use the Torah for personal gain. That was the previous Mishnah. So you're not supposed to use the Torah to raise credit to your name. You're not supposed to use the Torah as a means of earning a living. It's very clear that the Torah is not a means to the end for me. The Torah is not at my disposal. On the contrary, the Torah requires my dedication. We now go to the next step, which is not only are you not supposed to use the Torah for personal gain, but your attitude and the way that you engage with the Torah should specifically be how that you engage with the Torah in order to add value to the Torah, to bring kavod to the Torah, to bring honor to the Torah. Right? That was the flow of how this Mishnah picked up on the previous Mishnah. That's telling us something. It's switching our mentality. Not only am I not allowed to be a taker from the Torah, but I'm supposed to be somebody who adds to the Torah. Now, how can you possibly add to the Torah? The Torah is God's wisdom. The Torah is great. The Torah is perfect. The Torah is holy. It doesn't need you. So what possibly could Rabbi Yossi suggest that we should do that's going to add value to the Torah? Now, one thing we've learned about Rabbi Yossi already, earlier, right at the beginning, as we started the Mishnah, is nimukoi imoy. That Rabbi Yossi would explain Torah in such a way that there was a logical basis, and the value of a logical basis is that you can then present Torah even to people who don't belong to that world. It's just not their thing. They're not dedicated to Torah ideologically. They're not dedicated to Torah philosophically, spiritually, religiously. But any person can appreciate something that makes sense. So you present something to an individual in a way that is logical, and they can appreciate it. That's fantastic. It makes sense to me. Which means that you can bring honor to the Torah even outside of the Jewish world. See, in the Jewish world, I don't have to necessarily give you a logical explanation to the Torah in order for you to honor it. You're Jewish. You buy into the stuff. You believe in the concept of the divine origin of Torah. So Torah already has your respect. Rabbi Yossi says, I understand that not only am I not supposed to use the Torah to service me, but to the contrary, I'm supposed to service the Torah in order to broaden the honor of the Torah. It is easy to broaden the honor of the Torah in the Jewish world because we're susceptible, we're predisposed to it, we have a vested interest. The chap is, how do you share the value of Torah outside of the Jewish world? And Rabbi Yossi taught that by example, because as we've already identified, he went around specifically to this one particular Roman noblewoman who it appears had a big sphere of influence. I guess in today's world she'd be considered an influencer. That's actually a title that we use to refer to people in today's world. So she had her sphere of influence, and obviously it was beneficial to get her to a point of respect of Torah. So what happens when that occurs? So you got Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi as an example, and we're supposed to model his example. You go out into the world, and any one of us can do this, and it probably happens to us from time to time. You engage with people who are not Jewish, but they're intrigued. What does Judaism think about this? What do Jews believe about that? What is the Jewish wisdom on the next thing? And it's a wonderful opportunity for us. We're not in the business of proselytizing, and we're not even in the business of going out there and proactively teaching the Torah to the nations of the world. But when the opportunity does present itself, and when somebody is looking to understand and appreciate that wisdom, we need to be empowered. We need to have the tools to be able to share with them, like Rabbi Yossi did. What are the tools? Solid, rational explanations of ideas that can appeal to any person in any environment, no matter who they are. That's what Rabbi Yossi did. However, as soon as he did that, two things come to light. The first thing that comes to light is you have to realize the response that you're going to get is going to be from people who are brios. What are brios? So some people will refer to, and we learned this when we spoke about it in that Mishnah from Hillel in the first chapter. Some people have value because of their contribution to the world. Some people have value because of their intellectual contribution, some because of their charitable contribution, some because of their innovation. Everybody has a value that we could assign to a particular thing that happens in their life. And then you come across certain people and you say, I don't see what their value is. I don't believe they've ever contributed anything meaningful to the world. What is their value? To which we answer, brios. The fact that Hashem created such people, that is value. We don't understand it, we don't know how to define that value, but the fact that God created somebody, that is their value. So in the Jewish world, if somebody is not able to participate in Torah because they're not Jewish, they don't have the value in the Jewish world that you and I have. In other words, they cannot perform a mitzvah like you and I can. They cannot learn Torah in the way that you and I can. So technically, in our world, they're called brios. Rabbi Yossi teaches us that even those people who are brios, that means to say they're not participants in the Jewish journey, they still not only can, they do add value to our experience. Mechubed al abriyos. We get their acknowledgement and their respect, and that is something of absolute value. But the nature and extent of their respect will only be gufoi, the body. Why? Because at a neshama level, there are different kinds of neshamas. And there is no comparison between one kind of neshama and the next. There's no comparison between one family of neshama and the next. That's the way Hashem devised and designed the world. There's a family of neshamas called the Jewish people. We have a unique neshama that is considered, and I know some people find it to be a very difficult phrase to refer to, as the chosen people. It means to say that there's something unique that was imbued into our neshama. And then there are families of other types of neshamas, 70 different families of souls. And we don't have a spiritual similarity, as neither do those souls necessarily have a spiritual similarity to each other. So what unites us? What makes us feel the sense of shared humanity? The guf, the body, because it doesn't matter who you are. Nobody looks different. There might be pigmentation differences. There might be certain pronounced parts of the body in certain population groups. But at the end of the day, to be Jewish is not a racial element. It's got nothing to do with physical features. There are all kinds of Jewish people. So as far as the body is concerned, that's where we look and have the sense of commonality with everybody else. Therefore, gufoi mechubed al abriyos. What part of us is the non-Jewish world who appreciates the Torah that we teach? What part can they respect? The part that is similar. The part that we're not so similar, it's difficult to relate to and difficult to respect. And the message over here is very clear. The message is, if Rabbi Yossi went to all of that trouble to make the Torah make sense to people outside of the Jewish world so that they would give respect to the Torah, how much more so then is there a responsibility as a teacher, as a parent, as an influencer, to make sure that those Jewish people that we do touch and that we do have an influence on, that their experience of Judaism should be that it makes sense to them, that it is comfortable for them, and therefore it feels like a respectable experience for them. And that's why Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, when he taught Torah, made sure that everybody, including the simplest of the students, could understand logically what he was saying, because then they would have absolute respect. It's a great lesson for us. It's a great lesson that we should be willing to share the wisdom of Torah with others where appropriate, and that we shouldn't rely on people being Jewish and say, well, you just have to believe in all of this. We should explain things in a way that actually makes sense to them so that it's a respectable experience for them and for us.